When the winds roared and the mountains trembled, one figure stood firm against the storm. Not a soldier, but a wounded dog with a heart bigger than the wild itself. His name was Blaze. And in that frozen night, he reminded the world that bravery isn't measured by strength, but by the will to rise when everything says you can't. If you believe that heroes still walk among us on four legs, this is a story you'll never forget. The late winter air hung heavy over the Colorado Rocky Mountains, the cold so bitter it felt as if time itself had frozen. Snow blanketed the towering pines and jagged ridges in thick, untouched layers of white. The sky above was a flat sheet of gray clouds puffed with snow that had yet to fall. The wind blew through the narrow valleys, carrying a silence broken only by the occasional creak of frost-covered branches. This was a wilderness where there was no mercy, and on this particular day it would witness a struggle that most people did not see but that those who endured remembered. In a forgotten corner of the Rocky Mountain National Forest, far beyond the reach of marked trails and human footprints, a lone German shepherd waged a silent battle against the merciless elements and the slow betrayal of his own failing body. His name was Blaze, a name once proudly etched into the gleaming brass of a military tag, now nothing more than a memory. The badge long gone, his neck bare beneath the tangled remnants of his matted fur. Blaze was 2 years old, but his body bore the scars of battles far beyond his young age. His once proud frame strong and powerful, with a coat of deep sable and black markings that glistened under sunlight, now appeared gaunt, his ribs faintly visible beneath matted frost-caked fur. His eyes a sharp amber, once filled with fierce loyalty and determination, now reflected pain and confusion. His left hind leg dragged uselessly through the snow, a testament to the trauma he had suffered, a leg shattered by shrapnel during a failed mission overseas that left not just his body, but his spirit fractured. The military had deemed him too unstable for further service. He had been left behind, forgotten. Blaze had wandered for days through the snow-covered wilderness, each step slower, each breath heavier. Hunger gnawed at his insides, and the open wound across his side from a recent scuffle with wild coyotes burned with infection. But nothing had prepared him for what awaited at the frozen timberline. The mountain leopard appeared as if conjured from the swirling mist. A rare sight in these parts, this young male had been driven from his territory by an older dominant rival and now prowled closer to human borders in desperation. His coat was a mesmerizing canvas of silvery gray, spotted with deep black rosettes, muscles rippling beneath his sleek form as he moved with predatory grace. His emerald eyes were cold, calculated, and hungry. This was a hunter who knew his prey was already broken. Blaze sensed the danger before he saw it. His ears flattened against his head, his body lowering instinctively, but he had no strength left to flee. His paws slipped as he turned toward the growl that cut through the blizzard's howl. There, through the curtain of snow, the leopard advanced, shoulders rolling with each silent, deadly step, tail flicking low. Blaze stood his ground, despite his trembling limbs, his instincts screaming to fight, even if it meant his end. The battle was brutal and short-lived. Blaze lunged, first teeth bared, going straight for the leopard's throat, but the predator was faster, more agile. With a powerful swipe, the leopard's claws raked across Blaze's side, reopening the festering wound. Blaze collapsed into the snow, his vision blurring the world, tilting into a haze of red and white. The leopard stood over him for a moment, breath steaming in the icy air, eyes narrowed. Then, as if deciding the fight wasn't worth the effort against something already dying, it turned and disappeared into the fog-laden forest. Blaze lay there, his blood soaking into the snow, his breath shallow and ragged. Around him, the storm intensified, snow falling in the thick sheets that threatened to bury him alive. His mind drifted back to those brief days of belonging when a soldier's hand would stroke his head and call him good boy when purpose filled his days instead of this gnawing emptiness. His eyes fluttered closed, his heart slowing. Meanwhile, several miles down the mountain in the forgotten edges of the small town of Aspenwood, a man named Lucas Miller sat alone in a weather-beaten cabin tucked between ancient pines. Lucas was 55 years old, but carried the weight of a century's grief etched across his face. His tall, broad-shouldered frame had once commanded respect as a decorated veterinarian and wildlife rescuer, but now his posture slumped under the burden of sorrow. His hair, once a rich brown, had faded to silver, cropped short, and his sharp gray eyes held a haunted emptiness, a mirror to the tragedies he could not outrun. Lucas had lost his only son Daniel 5 winters ago to the same unforgiving wilderness he once loved. Daniel, a soldier and a man of courage, had disappeared during a rescue mission. In these very mountains his body never found his fate, a constant question mark hanging over Lucas's life. Since then Lucas had withdrawn from the world. His days passed in the silence of the forest, his hands still skilled but idle, his heart locked away behind walls of regret. He spoke to no one except the faded photograph of Daniel that sat atop the mantel, a silent testament to a life that felt forever unfinished. That afternoon, as the storm began to rage, Lucas found himself pacing restlessly by the frost-covered window. His breath fogged the glass as he stared into the swirling white void. Then, faintly beneath the howl of the wind, he heard it, a cry soft and barely audible, but unmistakably filled with pain. It wasn't the call of any wild animal. It was the desperate plea of something lost, something fighting to hold on to life. His old instincts flared. Against his better judgment, Lucas grabbed his thick wool coat, his boots heavy with snow dust from years of disuse, and headed out into the storm. He followed the sound, his senses sharpening, despite the bitter cold that gnawed at his joints. His boots crunched through the deep snow, his breath coming in ragged clouds. The cries grew louder, then weaker, until finally he found him, Blaze lying motionless beneath a ridge of snow-covered stone, his body half buried, his fur stained crimson. Lucas's heart clenched. The sight was too familiar. Memories of Daniel's last known location surged through his mind. Kneeling beside the dying dog, his hands trembling, Lucas felt for a heartbeat. Faint, but there. Without hesitation, he stripped off his coat, wrapped the shivering body in its warmth, and whispered through frozen lips, "Hold on, boy. Just hold on." With the storm intensifying and the road home a treacherous path of ice and regret, Lucas cradled Blaze against his chest and began the long, grueling trek back to his cabin, unaware that this single act of compassion was the first fragile step toward thawing the ice that had encased his heart for so many years. The storm was gathering its full wrath as Lucas Miller trudged toward the old meteorological station, perched on a ridge overlooking the frozen valley. Built decades ago, the station was now more of a forgotten relic than a functioning facility, but Lucas made it a point to check it during the harshest winters, as if ensuring anything remained under control. His tall frame wrapped in a threadbare parka, faded from deep forest green to a washed-out olive, moved steadily against the rising winds. Snow clung to his silver hair, and his weathered hands, calloused and cracked from years of labor and long-forgotten tenderness, tightened around the leather strap of his lantern. His sharp gray eyes, etched deep beneath a brow, permanently creased by grief and isolation, scanned the shifting horizon. As the trail bent beneath the shadow of a stone outcrop, something unusual caught his attention. Just beyond the jagged rocks, faint against the pristine snow, were wide, deliberate paw prints, too large for a coyote, too precise for a bear. Lucas crouched his knees, groaning in protest, and studied the marks. Sharp claw indentations slashed through the snow around the paw pads. His heart tightened. These weren't random. This was the calculated prowl of a predator. His mind flashed to the recent whispers in town, rumors of a mountain leopard forced down from the higher ranges by hunger and injury, desperate and dangerous. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it almost dissolved into the wail of the wind. A whimper, broken, fading. Moving quickly now, Lucas rounded the boulders, his boots sinking deep into drifts. And there, under the shelter of a cragged stone hollow, lay a creature more broken than any wild thing he had seen in years. Blaze. The German shepherd lay curled in a feeble attempt to preserve warmth, his matted fur stiff with ice and blood. His sides rose and fell in shallow, trembling breaths. Around him, the snow was disturbed with violent patterns, the aftermath of a struggle, and near the edge of the hollow, deep gashes scored the rock itself. The mountain leopard had been here, and Blaze had barely survived the encounter. Lucas felt a sharp stab in his chest. Memories he had spent years burying surged to the surface. Daniel, his son, had worn the same look of defiance in the final photo taken before his last deployment. And there had been another dog then, too, a strong, proud German shepherd named Rex, always at Daniel's side. When the news came that Daniel had gone missing, presumed dead in the unforgiving wilds of a foreign land, Rex had stopped eating his heart breaking as surely as Lucas's own. Losing them both had hollowed him out. Now, staring at Blaze's failing body, Lucas's hardened exterior cracked. He sank to his knees, his breath trembling as he reached out with a hesitant hand. Blaze flinched at the touch, his amber eyes barely able to focus. But in that weak gaze, Lucas saw something raw and familiar. A plea not for mercy, but for purpose. A reason to keep fighting. "You're not going to die out here," Lucas muttered under his breath, his voice roughened by years of silence. Without another thought, he shed his parka and wrapped the dog's limp body tightly, pulling him against his chest. The biting wind tore at them as he stood, every muscle in his back and legs protesting against the added weight. But there was no time to hesitate. The storm was rising, and the path back to his cabin was long and perilous. As he pushed against the elements far below in the valley, the lights of the small town of Aspenwood flickered like dying stars beneath the oncoming blizzard. At the same time, another figure braved the storm miles away. Emily Harris, Lucas's niece and the town's youngest wildlife officer at 28, was making her rounds near the town's outskirts. Petite but sturdy with copper-red hair, usually tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail, Emily had inherited her late mother's sharp features and her father's stubborn resilience. Her deep green eyes held a fierce intelligence, and her freckled face, despite its youthful appearance, often wore the hardened look of someone who had seen too much suffering in the wild to be fooled by its beauty. Emily knelt near a frozen creek, her gloved fingers brushing over a fresh set of tracks in the snow paw prints, just like the ones Lucas had seen. But these were fresher, leading toward the residential edges of Aspenwood. Her heart clenched. The mountain leopard was circling closer to human habitation. She stood brushing snow from her knees and pulled out her radio. "This is Officer Harris," she called through the static. "Confirming fresh tracks heading toward the southern perimeter. Possible mountain leopard activity near the school district. Alert patrol units and advise caution." The thought of the mountain leopard roaming so close to homes set her nerves on edge. She'd spent the last 2 years trying to educate the townspeople on coexistence with wildlife, but even she knew that a starving, injured predator didn't follow the usual patterns. It was a creature of desperation now, and that made it dangerous. As the storm grew in intensity, Emily made her way back toward her station, the wind howling through the tall pines, carrying with it a faint, unsettling growl that made her pause and glance back over her shoulder. Back in the high ridges, Lucas's cabin finally came into view, its sagging roof outlined against the swirling snow, a faint light flickering from the hearth within. Lucas kicked open the frozen door, staggering inside and collapsing onto the worn rug before the fireplace. His hands shook as he unwrapped Blaze from his coat and laid him down on a folded blanket near the glowing embers. Blaze barely stirred, his chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Lucas worked quickly, stoking the fire to life until it roared with warmth. He fetched a battered metal bowl, filling it with tepid water, and placing it near Blaze's muzzle. No, for a long moment, Lucas just sat there, his hand resting lightly on the dog's head, his thumb absently tracing the jagged line of an old scar hidden beneath the filthy fur. "You hold on, soldier," Lucas whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm not losing you too." The storm lingered for days, as if reluctant to loosen its grip on the mountains. Winds howled like old ghosts through the eaves of Lucas Miller's cabin, and snow pressed against the windows in soft, muffling waves. The world outside had disappeared beneath a blanket of white, but inside the small wooden structure, something fragile had begun to thaw. Blaze lay curled on a makeshift bed of wool blankets near the fireplace, his breathing shallow but steady. His wounded side, now dressed with clean gauze and ointment, salvaged from Lucas's dusty med kit, rose and fell in a rhythm that spoke of both pain and determination. His eyes, though still clouded by exhaustion, flicked open occasionally to study his surroundings, not with fear, but with a faint watchful curiosity. Lucas sat nearby in a creaking rocking chair, the firelight casting deep shadows across his lined face. He looked older than his 55 years, his beard unkempt skin, leathery from years of mountain wind and sun, but his posture had softened in the last day. For the first time in years, he wasn't entirely alone. He watched the dog with quiet intensity, his mind drifting back through time. The fire popped, sending a burst of sparks up the chimney, and Lucas spoke not to himself, as he had grown accustomed to, but to Blaze. "My boy used to build fires like this." He said, his voice low and rough, like gravel under snow. "Daniel, He had this way of getting the flame to catch with just one match. Drove me crazy. Blaze didn't move, but his ear twitched. Lucas took it as encouragement. He was a rescue paramedic. That's what he loved. Running toward trouble, saving people, animals, didn't matter. Always said life out here was worth protecting, even when the mountains turned cruel. Lucas paused, his eyes catching the reflection of the fire. Then one winter there was a call search and rescue team lost in the range after a mudslide. Daniel volunteered to go up. Took Rex with him, his German shepherd. Damn fine dog, strong, loyal. His voice wavered, then steadied. They never came back. Blaze shifted slightly, a quiet sound escaping his throat. Lucas reached forward and gently rested a hand on the dog's head. The contact was brief but grounding. It was the first time since Daniel's disappearance that Lucas had spoken about him aloud without bitterness or anger. The presence of Blaze was like a lantern in a long, dark tunnel, dim, flickering, but real. Meanwhile, down in Aspenwood, the storm had finally begun to break. Emily Harris. Lucas's niece had spent the past 48 hours poring over reports, footprints, and broken wildlife camera footage. The leopard's movements were erratic, unlike the careful prowling of a healthy predator. Something else was disrupting the wilderness balance. Inside her office at the ranger station, a converted barn with wood-paneled walls and the smell of old pine sap, Emily leaned over a spread of printed maps and track photos, her brow furrowed beneath the shadow of her short copper hair, now tousled from stress and lack of sleep. A stack of missing wildlife reports lay to her left, lynx foxes and even a young elk calf, all disappearing within a small radius near the outer limits of the protected zone. That's when Trevor Langley walked in, his boots thudding heavily on the old wooden floor. Trevor, a rugged man in his early 40s with a solid build and sun-creased skin, was the lead field ranger in Aspenwood. His demeanor was blunt, reliable, and not prone to exaggeration. He tugged off his gloves and set a folded wildlife camera in front of her. Found this near the Ridgebrook logging trail. Camera was knocked over, but the last image caught something strange. Emily turned the screen on. The final photo showed a set of boots, military style, deep-treaded beside a steel snare trap, camouflaged with brush. It wasn't wildlife. It was poaching. "That's inside the sanctuary zone," she muttered, tracing the GPS tag. "They're baiting the leopard. Or worse," Trevor said, crossing his arms. "They're trying to catch something rarer. This isn't just some backwoods hunter. These are professionals." Emily nodded, her mind already racing through the implications. The poachers were exploiting the fear surrounding the leopard, using it as cover for their own operations. It made sense. The big cat's presence had already rerouted patrols, scared off hikers, and thinned the usual foot traffic. It was the perfect smokescreen. "I'll need to talk to Sheriff Danvers," she said, already reaching for her coat, "and get extra patrols on the northeast perimeter." Back in the mountains, night had settled deep. Lucas prepared a weak broth from leftover chicken, letting it simmer on the old wood stove. He spooned a few drops onto a flat dish and slid it slowly toward Blaze. The dog sniffed at it, then licked tentatively. A moment later, he took a few small, shaky mouthfuls. "That's it," Lucas whispered. "Slow and steady." The fire cracked again, and Lucas leaned back, feeling something loosen in his chest. He didn't recognize it at first. It wasn't grief or fatigue. It was purpose. Later that night, Lucas didn't retreat to his usual bedroom, a cramped space cluttered with old boxes and untouched memories. He laid out an extra blanket beside Blaze's bedding and sat down on the floor, his back against the cabin wall. The wind outside howled like it always had, but it didn't seem so empty anymore. In the flickering glow of firelight, Blaze stirred slightly, shifting closer to the man who had rescued him. He rested his head on Lucas's worn boot, and for the first time in years, Lucas let sleep come, knowing something else. Someone else was breathing quietly beside him in the dark. The storm had passed, but it left behind a silence that felt heavier than the snow piled against the cabin walls. For the first time in days, sunlight spilled hesitantly through the frost-lined windows, casting faint golden patterns across the worn wooden floors. Outside, the Rockies stretched endlessly beneath a brilliant sky, their peaks sharp and clean against the horizon, the snowfields below untouched except for faint traces of life pressed into their surface. Blaze was stronger now. Though his movements still held a hint of stiffness, the fire of his instincts had reignited. His sleek sable coat had regained some of its sheen, and the deep wounds along his flank, carefully tended by Lucas, had begun to close. This morning, as Lucas pulled on his old leather boots and prepared to gather firewood from the edge of the forest, Blaze was already on his feet, tail low, but steady following, with silent determination. Lucas paused by the door and glanced down at him. "You sure about this, boy?" His voice was gruff, but laced with the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Blaze lifted his head, his sharp amber eyes locked on the door, alert and unwavering. Lucas sighed and pushed the door open. The cold hit them immediately, but it felt less oppressive under the clear sky. They moved together through the clearing, Blaze scanning every shadow, every broken branch with the caution of a soldier on patrol. As Lucas bent to gather a bundle of dry twigs near a fallen pine, Blaze stiffened. His ears shot forward toward the line of trees just beyond the clearing. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in Blaze's chest. Lucas felt the old instincts kick in. He rose from the snow, his eyes following Blaze's intense focus toward the tree line. From the dense undergrowth came a faint rustle, the kind that doesn't belong to wind or falling snow. Then a flash of movement, a shadow darting low along the tree line. Lucas caught a glimpse of it, a lithe, powerful form slipping between the pines. The mountain leopard. Its form blended into the landscape, but its eyes glinted through the branches before vanishing. Blaze didn't lunge or bark. He simply stood his ground between Lucas and the tree line, his gaze unwavering, muscles coiled and ready. Lucas took a slow breath and reached for the rifle slung across his back. The leopard wasn't hunting out of instinct anymore. It was circling closer, testing boundaries, driven by a desperation that made it reckless. "We're not ready for a fight today," Lucas muttered under his breath, signaling Blaze back toward the cabin. With practiced discipline, Blaze followed, his head constantly turning to scan their surroundings. Meanwhile, miles below in Aspenwood, Emily Harris stood in the crowded conference room of the ranger station. Her copper hair was hastily pulled back, her green eyes sharper than ever, despite the exhaustion etched across her face. Before her, a detailed map of the sanctuary spread across the long table, dotted with fresh red markers. Trevor Langley stood beside her, arms crossed, his rugged features set in a deep frown. "This isn't just a few opportunists," he said, his voice low. "They're organized, coordinated, and they know exactly where to set their traps." Emily tapped one of the red marks near Black Hollow Pass. "They're funneling the leopard toward this area, using bait to manipulate its path, clearing the sanctuary of other wildlife as they go. Classic poaching strategy, but far more dangerous with a predator like this involved." A door creaked open at the back of the room, and Sheriff Grant Danvers entered. In his early 60s, Danvers was a tall, imposing man, with broad shoulders, a square jaw, and a perpetual squint from years of mountain sun. He didn't waste words. "You're sure about this?" Harris Emily turned to him without hesitation. "Dead sure. If we don't act now, they'll either capture that leopard alive and sell it, or worse, it'll lash out at civilians if cornered." Danvers nodded grimly. "You've got the green light. Take whoever you need." By dusk, Emily and her team were already moving out. Snow crunched under their boots as they fanned out toward the known snare locations. Radios crackled softly as positions were called out, each unit prepared for both human and animal threats. Back at the cabin, the evening settled in with a strange tension. Blaze sat near the front door, his body alert, ears flicking at every sound beyond the flickering firelight. Lucas sat nearby, his hands resting loosely over the stock of his rifle. The fire popped and cracked, but neither man nor dog seemed comforted by its warmth. Lucas found himself speaking again, his voice low, more to himself than to the room. "Something's shifting out there, boy. Feels like the whole forest is holding its breath." Blaze turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Lucas's with a knowing intensity. In the quiet that followed, they both listened to the wind, to the faint creaks of the old cabin, and to the unspoken promise that, whatever came next, they'd face it together. The night draped over the Rockies like a heavy shroud, dense clouds smothering the moonlight and turning the landscape into a realm of shadows. A bitter cold pressed against the earth, and though the storm had passed, the air remained electric with unspoken tension. Somewhere beyond the snow-laden trees, danger prowled. Inside the modest cabin, Lucas sat by the frosted window, his old Winchester rifle resting across his lap. Blaze lay near the door, his body tense, ears flicking at every faint sound carried by the wind. The bond between man and dog had grown unshakable over the past days, forged by hardship and survival. And tonight, both of them felt it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Near midnight, Blaze stood abruptly, Muscle's rigid eyes locked on the dense woods beyond the clearing. A low, guttural growl vibrated through his chest. Lucas moved to the door, without hesitation, peering out into the dark. At first, there was only the deep black of the forest. Then, a faint glimmer, a reflection of metal caught in the weak glow from the cabin. Lucas grabbed his lantern and rifle. He turned to Blaze, voice low and calm. "Stay close, boy." Blaze responded with a soft whine, standing alert at Lucas's side. Together, they stepped into the frigid night. The snow crunched under Lucas's boots as he led the way toward the edge of the clearing. Blaze stayed ahead, his movements fluid but precise, despite his still-healing injuries. Near the base of a cluster of old pines, Lucas spotted it, a crude steel snare, half buried beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. It was well hidden, expertly placed. Lucas knelt to inspect it, his calloused fingers tracing the cruel wire. "Trained professionals," he muttered under his breath. Blaze's growl deepened. Lucas glanced up and caught movement just beyond the tree line. Two figures moved among the trees, their outlines faint against the swirling mist. Both wore heavy winter gear, faces obscured by scarves and hoods. One was tall and lean, moving quickly and purposefully. The other was broader, slower his posture, exuding quiet menace. Lucas immediately recognized the type poachers and not amateurs. These men knew the terrain. They had a purpose, and it wasn't hunting for survival. Blaze stepped in front of Lucas, his head-low teeth bared just enough to flash in the dim light. The taller man paused and pulled binoculars from under his coat. He spotted them and nudged his companion. The broad man took a step forward, his voice rough and cold. "You're a long way from town, old man." Lucas kept his rifle steady. "Looks like you are too, and it seems you've left something behind." His eyes flicked toward the hidden snare. The man chuckled darkly. "That's not garbage, friend. That's just business." Before the confrontation could escalate, Blaze lunged forward, barking sharply. The sound cracked through the frozen air like a warning shot. The poachers exchanged a quick glance and disappeared into the woods without hesitation, their retreat too smooth to be panic. Lucas knew they'd be back, and they weren't finished. Lucas knelt to disarm the snare, working quickly. But as he turned to head back toward the cabin, Blaze froze mid-step. Lucas didn't see the second trap until it was too late. Blaze barked sharply, lunging forward to shove Lucas aside, just as the hidden snare snapped shut. The steel loop caught Blaze's hind leg, yanking him off balance with brutal force. Lucas's heart clenched. Blaze struggled, his body thrashing against the biting wire, blood already staining the snow beneath him. "Easy, boy." "Hold still." Lucas dropped to his knees, his fingers working frantically against the freezing metal. The mechanism was stiff and viciously tight. Blaze whimpered but didn't cry out again. His amber eyes locked on Lucas's face, filled with pain but unwavering trust. With a final twist, the trap released its hold. Lucas pulled Blaze free and cradled his injured leg. The wound was deep but not life-threatening. He gathered Blaze into his arms despite the dog's weight and hurried back toward the cabin as fast as his tired legs could carry them. Meanwhile, miles away near Black Hollow Pass, Emily Harris crouched low behind a rocky outcropping. Her breath rose in sharp clouds as she studied a line of deep snowshoe prints leading toward the northern ridge. Her copper hair was tucked under a knit cap, her green eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into her young face. Behind her, the members of her patrol team waited in tense silence. Her radio crackled softly, and Trevor Langley's voice came through. "We've spotted the mountain leopard. It's cornered near the ridge, injured. I think the poachers are moving in tonight." Emily's pulse quickened. "Hold position. I'm moving in." With practiced efficiency, she signaled her team forward. As they approached the rocky slope, Emily caught sight of the mountain leopard. The great predator lay just below a stone ledge, one paw bloodied its powerful chest, heaving with shallow breaths. Even wounded, its eyes burned with raw defiance and unyielding will to survive. Before she could reach it, gunshots cracked through the night air. The poachers were closing in fast. Emily motioned for her team to fan out their flashlights, cutting beams through the darkness. "Drop your weapons and step away from the animal." Emily called out, her voice sharp and commanding. A tense silence followed. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, the same broad-shouldered man Lucas had seen earlier. His face remained hidden beneath a scarf, but his stance was tense, one hand lingering dangerously near his coat. Emily stood her ground. "This is your last warning." For a long moment it seemed the man might draw a weapon. But then, with a final cold glance, he melted back into the forest. Emily rushed forward with her team surrounding the injured mountain leopard. She approached, slowly crouching near the mountain leopard's trembling form. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." The night crept in colder and heavier than any before. A renewed snowstorm tore through the mountains, howling against the fragile walls of Lucas's cabin like a living thing. The old wooden beams groaned under the weight of the blizzard, and outside the forest vanished into a swirling void of white chaos. Inside, Lucas sat by the fire, tension coiled in every line of his weathered face. His rifle leaned against the hearth within easy reach. Blaze lay nearby, his head resting on his front paws, ears flicking toward every creak and distant groan of the storm. His injured leg had been wrapped carefully, but despite the wound, his posture was alert, his amber eyes sharp. Lucas poured a shallow bowl of warm broth and pushed it toward Blaze. "Eat what you can, boy. We'll both need our strength tonight." Blaze lifted his head, lapped at the broth weakly, then turned his attention back toward the door. His instincts told him something was coming, something worse than the storm itself. Out beyond the safety of the cabin, deeper in the timberline, the mountain leopard moved through the storm like a phantom. Exhaustion and pain burned through its sinewy body. One paw dragged slightly still, bleeding from the crude wire snare it had escaped. Hunger gnawed at its ribs. The storm had driven it mad with desperation, its injured body pushed to the brink. No longer did it hunt for survival. It hunted out of pure, untamed rage. In the nearby town of Aspenwood, lights flickered under the weight of the storm. Most residents had locked their doors tight, unaware of the predator now dangerously close. But Emily Harris wasn't resting. Wrapped in her thick ranger's jacket, her copper hair pulled back under a knit hat, she stood on the porch of the ranger station radio, in hand. "Trevor, report." "Any sign of the leopard?" she asked, her voice tight through the static. Trevor's reply came crackling through. "Tracks lead straight toward the southern outskirts. It's heading dangerously close to the residential area. I'm sending teams out now." Emily's heart clenched. "We're running out of time," she muttered, her breath clouding in the freezing air. Back at the cabin, the storm momentarily shifted. The howling wind paused the silence so sudden it felt unnatural. That's when Blaze sat up straight, his body rigid, eyes locked on the frost-lined window. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Lucas stood and reached for his rifle. "Stay behind me, Blaze," he commanded, knowing full well the dog would do no such thing. Then from the swirling snow, a shadow emerged near the edge of the clearing. The mountain leopard had found them. It was a terrifying sight. Even in its weakened state, the predator's powerful frame was imposing its head, low muscles coiled beneath its ragged coat. Its breath steamed in the icy air, and its green eyes glowed with the wild desperation of a creature cornered by fate itself. The leopard stepped forward, its massive paws silent against the snow, despite the storm. Blaze placed himself between Lucas and the predator, his stance unshakable, despite the pain in his leg. His hackles raised, teeth bared in a snarl that echoed faintly against the storm-muted woods. Lucas's heart raced. He had his rifle ready, but a part of him hesitated. Killing this animal wasn't justice, it was tragedy. With a snarl, the leopard lunged. Blaze met the charge head-on, throwing himself into the path of the oncoming beast. The clash was brutal. The leopard's paw lashed out, catching Blaze across the shoulder and sending him sprawling into the snow with a yelp of pain. But even before the snow settled, Blaze struggled back to his feet, blood now staining the white ground beneath him. The mountain leopard advanced again, a low, rumbling growl vibrating from deep within its chest. Blaze stood firm, his legs trembling, but his eyes fierce, refusing to back down. Lucas took a deep breath, raised his rifle, and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot tore through the night, louder than the storm itself. The leopard froze its head, whipping toward the sound, ears flattened. For a long, suspended moment, man, dog, and predator stood locked in a standoff under the falling snow. Then slowly the mountain leopard lowered its head, letting out one final growl before turning and disappearing back into the white wilderness, its form swallowed by the storm. Lucas dropped to his knees beside Blaze. The dog's sides heaved with every painful breath, but he was alive. His amber eyes met Lucas's once more, and even in the pain, there was pride. Lucas gently ran his hand over Blaze's bloodied fur. "You did good, boy. You held the line." Inside the cabin once again, Lucas worked quickly to clean Blaze's fresh wounds. The storm raged on, but the cabin felt a little warmer now, not because of the fire, but because of the unspoken bond that had just been sealed by courage and loyalty. The storm had not relented. Sheets of snow fell in wild swirls, the icy wind screaming through the mountain passes. Roads became nothing more than vague white ribbons vanishing into oblivion. But Lucas Miller didn't care. He gritted his teeth, his weathered hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel of his battered old pickup as it skidded dangerously along the winding mountain road. The truck's headlights barely pierced the whiteout, and every few seconds the tires lost their grip, sending the vehicle sliding perilously close to the edge of sheer cliffs. Beside him, Blaze lay on the passenger seat, wrapped in a thick ranger's jacket. His breaths came shallow and labored, each exhale a painful wheeze. Blood seeped through the hastily wrapped bandages around his shoulder and flank, staining the jacket a dark, ominous red. His eyes, though dulled by pain, flickered open every so often to meet Lucas's gaze. There was still a flicker of fight left in them, a silent refusal to give in. "Hold on, boy," Lucas muttered, his voice rough with emotion. "You've come too far to give up now." The road to Denver was a brutal gauntlet under normal circumstances, but tonight it felt endless. Each mile was a battle against the storm, against the weight of years of regret pressing down on Lucas's chest. The old truck groaned and rattled its engine, protesting against the cold and the brutal climb. Back in Aspenwood, Emily Harris and her team were executing their final mission of the night. The storm had driven both man and beast to the brink, and in the chaos, the wounded mountain leopard had slipped through the cracks of the wilderness and wandered dangerously close to the southern ridges. Emily stood at the head of her team, her copper-red hair damp with snow eyes sharp and unwavering beneath the brim of her ranger's hat. Her breath formed clouds in the freezing air as she signaled for silence. Beside her, Trevor Langley stood tall, his rugged face set in a determined scowl. They had tracked the mountain leopard to a narrow ravine, a natural bottleneck where the great predator now stood cornered. Its body trembled from exhaustion and blood loss, yet even in its weakened state, it held its head high, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Emily approached slowly, her gloved hands raised to show she meant no harm. "Easy now," she spoke gently, her voice carrying through the storm. "No more traps, no more pain, just a way home." The leopard's emerald eyes fixed on her, its tail flicking low against the snow-covered ground. For a moment it seemed as if the great predator might lunge, but something in Emily's calm, unwavering stance held it back. Her years of studying wild animals, her belief in their right to freedom, echoed in her every move. Behind her, Trevor moved into position with the tranquilizer rifle. At Emily's nod, he fired. The dart found its mark, and within moments the leopard's body swayed, its legs folding beneath it as the fight drained away. By dawn, the mountain leopard would be safely transported back to a remote, protected part of the sanctuary. Emily watched as her team worked quickly but gently to prepare the animal for transport, a faint smile crossing her tired features. For once, they had managed to outmaneuver both poachers and the unforgiving wild. Meanwhile, on the icy roads leading to Denver, Lucas's battered truck finally broke through the last stretch of mountain road. The lights of the city glowed faintly ahead, like a distant promise. At the veterinary emergency clinic on the outskirts of Denver, the faint sound of the truck's sputtering engine was a herald of desperation. Dr. Melissa Grant, a seasoned veterinarian in her early 40s, petite with sharp observant eyes and a calm authority in every movement, was just finishing her night rounds when she heard the vehicle skid into the parking lot. Within moments, Lucas burst through the doors, Blaze cradled in his arms. Melissa's trained eyes assessed the situation instantly. "Get him on the table," she ordered, snapping into action. The clinic's sterile environment became a flurry of motion. Melissa worked with practiced precision, her hands moving swiftly to stabilize Blaze's breathing, administer pain relief, and stop the bleeding. Her assistant, a young vet tech named Aiden, nervous but eager, moved at her side, handing instruments and supplies as she barked rapid-fire instructions. Lucas stood to the side, his fists clenched, his eyes locked on Blaze's still form. He hadn't prayed in years, but standing there, he found himself silently begging for a miracle. Melissa's voice cut through the tension. "He's a fighter," she muttered, her hand stitching the worst of the wounds. "But this is going to be close." Hours seemed to pass in the span of heartbeats. Then, at last, Blaze's breathing steadied. His heartbeat, once a faint flutter, grew stronger beneath the monitors. Melissa stepped back, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "He's out of the woods for now," she said quietly. Lucas approached the table, his weathered hand gently resting on Blaze's head. "You did it, soldier," he whispered. "You made it." By morning, the storm had passed. Pale winter sunlight streamed through the clinic windows, casting a soft glow over the recovery room. Lucas sat by Blaze's side, unwilling to leave his hand, never leaving the dog's paw. And for the first time in a long, long while, he felt something that had nearly been lost to him: hope. The long winter finally surrendered to the breath of spring. High above the rugged peaks of the Rockies, the snow melted in glittering streams that raced down into the valleys, feeding the awakening earth. Aspenwood stirred from its frozen slumber, and life bloomed again beneath a sky painted in soft pastels of morning light. On the outskirts of town, the newly restored animal clinic stood proud against the backdrop of green meadows and blooming wildflowers. Lucas Miller stood outside, leaning on the old white fence, the wood smooth under his calloused hands. His silver hair caught the morning sun, and his face, once shadowed by grief, now wore a quiet contentment. Beside him sat Blaze, the German shepherd, whose story had become legend in these mountains. Blaze's once terrible wounds had healed into proud scars, and though he moved with a slight limp, his spirit was untouched. His fur gleamed under the spring sun, his amber eyes bright and alert. A blue silk scarf gifted by one of the town's children was tied gently around his neck, marking him not just as a survivor, but as a hero. This was the day of the Rocky Spring Festival, and for the first time in years, Lucas felt like a part of his community again. The main square of Aspenwood was alive with music and laughter stalls brimming with local crafts, and food children running through the streets with bright kites soaring in the breeze. But the heart of the festival was a special ceremony held at the town's small stone plaza. A new monument had been commissioned, a life-size bronze statue of Blaze captured in mid-stance, head raised proudly, eyes forever watching over the town. The statue stood atop a base engraved with the words, "Courage never fades. Love never fails." Lucas and Blaze arrived just as the mayor, Margaret Dalton, took the stage. Margaret was a tall woman in her 60s, graceful despite her years. Her silver hair was neatly pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, adorned with fresh wildflowers. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who had guided the town through storms both literal and metaphorical. Today she began, her voice carrying clearly over the gathered crowd. "We honor not just a remarkable animal, but the spirit of hope and resilience he represents." Blaze reminds us all that even in the darkest winters, courage can light the way back to life. The crowd erupted in applause. Children gathered around Blaze, who stood calmly, despite the flurry of little hands patting his head and stroking his scarred shoulders. His presence brought a hush to even the most restless hearts. At the end of the ceremony, Lucas was invited to say a few words. He approached the podium slowly, his voice low but steady as he spoke. "There was a time I thought I'd lost everything worth living for." He began, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the townspeople. "But this dog, this brave soul reminded me that life has a way of finding us again, even when we think we've turned our backs on it." He looked down at Blaze, who sat proudly at his feet. Blaze didn't just survive. He fought for every breath, every step. And through him, I found my way back too. Later that afternoon, back at the clinic, Lucas unlocked the front doors for the first time in years. Fresh paint brightened the old walls, and the smell of new wood mixed with the faint scent of spring blossoms that drifted through the open windows. A polished sign above the door now read, "Miller Veterinary and Healing Center." Inside, a new addition had been made, a cozy corner, lined with soft cushions and shelves filled with books about animals and kindness. It was Blaze's space where children could sit and read, stroke his fur, and hear his story from Lucas himself. They called it Blaze's Corner of Courage. That day, the first visitors arrived. A group of children from the local orphanage led by their caretaker, Sarah Bennett. Sarah was a slender woman in her early 40s, her gentle smile hiding the hardships she'd endured. Her chestnut brown hair was tied back loosely, and a faded silver locket hung around her neck, a keepsake from a sister she'd lost years ago. Despite her own pain, Sarah devoted her life to helping children who had no families. Her kind but firm nature earning the love and respect of all who met her. As she led the children into the clinic, their eyes lit up at the sight of Blaze. One little girl, barely 6 years old, with curly auburn hair and big green eyes named Emma, hesitated near the doorway. Lucas noticed her small frame and the way she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit. "Would you like to say hello?" Lucas asked, gently kneeling beside her. Emma bit her lip, but took a tentative step forward. Blaze lowered his head to her level, his tail sweeping the floor in a slow, friendly wag. Emma reached out a trembling hand and placed it on Blaze's head. A moment later, a shy smile broke across her face. For the first time in months, she laughed a bright, beautiful sound that filled the room like sunshine after rain. Sarah met Lucas's gaze from across the room, her eyes shining. "He's doing more healing here than most doctors ever could," she said softly. As the sun began to set over the Rockies, Lucas and Blaze took one final walk to the stone plaza. Together, they stood before the statue under the golden light of dusk. Lucas placed a hand on the cool bronze shoulder of the statue and looked down at Blaze. "We made it, old friend," he murmured. "And maybe this is where we were always meant to be." The breeze rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of new beginnings. And there, under the fading light, man and dog stood together, a living testament to courage, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a wounded heart and the loyal soul who saved it. In the rush of our busy days, it's easy to forget that small acts of kindness can create the biggest changes. Like Blaze, we don't need to be perfect or powerful to make a difference. We just need to show up, stay loyal, and choose love, even when it's hard. Sometimes all it takes is one brave heart to remind the world that hope is never lost. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs a little courage today. Hit the like button, subscribe for more stories of hope and healing, and leave a comment below. Tell us, when was the last time a simple act of kindness changed your day? We'd love to read your story.